Cool. It seems everybody can hear me. There, at the bottom there is a chat little bubble. So if anybody wants to ask any questions, you're more than welcome just to put your questions to that chat bubble, and I'll try to answer those as we go along. The idea is for me to talk for approximately, say, 45 minutes or so, and then we can start chatting and see doing some answer and chat about some questions and so on. So thank you very much for everybody. Thank you very much, Nadia, for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. And I'm sitting indeed in a cold Pretoria, and not that bad actually. Yesterday was much colder. And what I'm really amazed about is exactly what is happening now, and that we've got 100 people on this new platform called Zoom, and all of a sudden everybody is an expert on this new technology. So I think what we are seeing here is indeed the fourth industrial revolution happening, fast forwarding. And it's absolutely just amazing to see how things have been happening. In fact, I haven't been this busy probably ever in my life. Our team, we're working very hard, and I think one of the biggest problems that we are experiencing is that because people are sitting at home, they don't have much to do, and that means that even in the middle of the night, sometimes I get emails from people because you've got nothing else to do, you can just as well work. All right, so the idea with my presentation of my talk is that I'm going to have a look at the international political and economic environment. It's important for South Africa to understand what is going on internationally. And the reason for that is simply because the South African economy is a small open economy, and a small open economy like South Africa is affected by whatever happens internationally. And I'm going to touch on some of the international trends, politics and economics. Then I'm going to move to South Africa, touch a little bit on politics in South Africa. And I see there are some questions already about politics in South Africa that I've received previously. So talk a little bit about politics in South Africa, which is quite a mess. And then have a look at the South African economy as well, which is an even bigger mess. And then maybe see if we can look into my crystal ball to see if we can get some sort of indication of what's going to happen and what kind of world it is that we are going to live in future. It's going to be completely different. Okay, let's get going. Let's start. Let's have a look at the international political economic environment. Before the crisis, before this corona crisis, the world economy was already slowing down. There were a couple of reasons for that. One important reason is a political reason. Let's just call it new nationalism. And I think Donald Trump is an excellent example of a new nationalist, but it's not only Donald Trump. There are many other examples of people, of new nationalists out there. I think Narendra Modi from India is a good example of that. Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil is a very good example of new nationalism. And I think Brexit is another example of new nationalism. So we saw this wave, political wave of new nationalism internationally, and usually that leads to things like, for example, trade wars and the like. And we saw that. We know about Donald Trump being in a trade war with the Chinese, but it's not only him, there are many other examples as well. And this new form of nationalism also leads to things like, for example, countries leaving existing trade blocs, like the Brits deciding to leave the European Union. The South African economy will be affected by these sort of things because of, like I've mentioned, we are a small open economy, and whenever there are some political changes, that usually result in capital moving around, and that can lead to a weaker currency for the South African rand, or a stronger currency, and I'll talk a little bit about the South African currency as well. There are two very important trends on the economic front that need some special attention. The first one is that governments internationally are the biggest they've ever been. So states or governments or politicians are spending more money today internationally than ever before. And not only are they spending more money than ever before, and not only are politicians involved in just about everything of our daily lives, they also, of course, need to fund all of this. And that means that taxes internationally are very high as well. But that wasn't sufficient to fund the spending spree of politicians, and they've been borrowing like there is no tomorrow. And the debt levels of governments or the debt levels of states internationally are currently at record high levels. Now, I can give you some numbers, but state debt levels are very, very high. And from a financial point of view, one would have expected that many of these different governments would have been in big financial trouble long ago. They're not, and there's a very good reason why governments can keep on borrowing like the way they have been in recent years. And they do that because of the actions of central bankers. The central bankers, and that's the second trend that is very important to understand, especially in the past 10 years, central banks have become very, very powerful institutions, and central banks have been started doing all sorts of very weird things internationally. Like, for example, they've been cutting interest rates. Now, I'm talking about the big central banks internationally, like, for example, the European Central Bank, or the Federal Reserve in America, or the Bank of England, or the Bank of Japan, or the People's Bank of China. So the big central banks, what they have been doing in recent years, they've been cutting interest rates to very, very low levels, to record low levels. And in fact, in some instances, interest rates are below zero. Now, when I was at university, we didn't even talk about that. That wasn't even part of monetary economics. We didn't even study the possibility of interest rates going below zero. Although there was some academic reference to that, but that wasn't, nobody ever thought that we will live in a world where interest rates will be cut to zero or below zero. And remember, when interest rates are this low, essentially what happens is that if I'm an asset manager, and I am an asset manager, not a European, I'm a South African asset manager, I take people's money and I put it in various asset classes. But if I'm an European asset manager and you come to me and you tell me to invest your money in the money market, I will give you a guarantee, and that guarantee is I'm going to give you less money back, because that's what it means with interest rates below zero. So with interest rates below zero, the result of that was, of course, that it led to all sorts of distortions on the world financial markets. If you can't put money in the bank because the money gets less, or if you put it in the bank, the money market, asset managers started buying equities, and that's part of the reason why we've had a massive bull run on the world equity markets the last 10 years. That's not all that central banks did. They not only did they cut interest rates to exceptionally low levels, they've also started with all sort of other kind of shenanigans. Like, for instance, they would print money out of nothing. And remember, a central bank can literally print money out of nothing. And when they print money out of nothing, they use this money to buy government debt instruments. And that's the reason why governments can borrow so much money, because their central banks essentially print money and give them money. And what's been happening in the whole process, now remember, when debt goes up, interest rates usually go up with that as well. The weird thing is in the world is that debt levels have been going up, but at the same time, interest rates have been coming down. And that's because central banks, they have been buying all the government debt instruments, and they call it quantitative easing. So much so that in some instances, they kept on buying government debt instruments that the long-term interest rates on government debt instruments are in many instances also below zero. For instance, if you want to lend money to the German government, you have to pay the German government to take your money. I mean, that's the weird world in which we are living today. So that's where we were before the crisis. And then we heard about this horrible virus coming from China, and the world economy shut down, basically, and the world today is in a recession. It's very clear that most economies in Europe are going through a significant contraction. That means they are in a deep recession. And it's also quite clear that many other economies, like, for example, the American economy is going to go through the deepest recession since the Great Depression. The same goes for the Japanese, and some of the other major economies like the Chinese and the Indians and so on also will see a significant slowdown in economic growth or a further contraction. So the world, the globe, the world economy is currently in a recession, and quite a deep recession. In fact, the recession the world finds itself in at the moment is probably can only be compared to the 1920s, the Great Depression. So I think one can actually call the current environment a depressed environment, or a Great Depression, a second Great Depression that the world is going through at the moment. So that's the international environment. A few comments about that. I think it's going to take some time for the world economy to get out of this. Eventually, the world economy, of course, will start growing a little bit faster, depending on which one of the economies that you're talking about. But the debt hangover after this depression is going to be significant. And I think one can compare it to the world just after the Second World War, with many countries with mountains of war debt that had to be repaid, and in many instances it took them literally decades to pay off this debt. And that's where the world finds itself at the moment. One can look at this crisis as a kind of a war, in a way. The damage to the world economy is pretty much similar. Coming to South Africa, a few comments about South Africa. First, perhaps a few political comments about South Africa. Let me just get this off my chest, and that is that the tripartite alliance under the leadership, the senior leadership of the ANC, is probably the most destructive force that has ever hit. We have never seen so much damage done to the South African economy as what we saw the past 10 years. It happened before that, actually. It's not only the past 10 years. It started long before that. But there's immense damage to the economy at all sort of levels. There are, I guess, reasons for that. Remember, the ANC is what used to be essentially a liberation organization. Just after 1994, it turned itself into a new liberal kind of political party. And gradually, especially in the past 10 years, it rediscovered its liberation credentials again. So I guess it's a liberation organization all over again. Okay, there's a question about investments. I'll get to the investments later on in the talk. So the ANC is still a liberation organization at heart, I believe. And additionally, we have two other organizations in the tripartite alliance as well. The one is COSATU, and the job of COSATU is basically to provide a home for the worker in South Africa. That used to be their job, but today COSATU is essentially the home for the civil servant. More than 50% of COSATU members are civil servants. That's very important because of reasons I'm going to mention just now. The third role player is the South African Communist Party, and they are more in when you look at the ideology of communism, one can call the South African Communist Party more in the camp of the Leninists, which is the bad part of communism. So they are more Leninists in their persuasion than Marxists, really. Now, one major difference between Marxism and Leninism is simply that in the case of Leninism, Lenin believed in a centralization of power, like Karl Marx said, no, power should be with the people or with the Soviet. The Soviet, by the way, is a Russian word that means local authority. So what we've got a mixture of liberation organizations with a very strong Leninist basis, and they believe in centralization of power. And they also, additionally, we have this official policy of the ANC of cadre deployment. And essentially what has happened is that the ANC has become this huge network of patronage in South Africa. Now, although I've been referring to the ANC and the Tripartite Alliance in terms of certain ideologies, actually, the Tripartite Alliance is an organization without an ideology. And the reason why I say so is that when you listen to many of our political leaders, they will use the rhetoric of certain ideologies. So you will hear words like, for example, exploitation. You will hear words like, for example, nationalization. And the typical, leftist kind of liberation kind of words that one would associate with socialist or communist political movements. And indeed, that is the kind of language that we hear from the Tripartite Alliance and the leadership thereof quite a lot. But they only use that to achieve certain things. They're using the ideology, or they use the jargon of the leftist ideologies, not for ideological purposes, but simply because that allows them to expand the reach of the state. Because the ANC and the ANC Alliance exist today for one reason and one reason only. It's not an ideologically driven organization anymore. It's simply living off the state. And they're using ideology for that purpose. Now, this is a very important statement to make because the state has grown tremendously in South Africa. The state is very big in South Africa. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And we need to cut back on state spending. And that's going to be extremely difficult to do simply because if you cut back on state spending, you are touching the Tripartite Alliance and the whole patronage system. And they're not going to allow that. So we need to cut back on state spending because the numbers simply do not add up anymore. We can't do that politically because that will affect the existence of the tripartite alliance. They simply live off the state. A good example is South African Airways. We should be closing down South African Airways. We can't do that because they live off the state. They live off South African Airways and many of these other institutions. So we have, that's a political reality in South Africa. Maybe specifically, if we look at politics in South Africa, there are a number of conflicts that are unavoidable. We've seen some of these conflicts already. One conflict is an ideological conflict or a leadership conflict in the tripartite alliance. We still have to discover who really is in charge of the ANC or the tripartite alliance. Is it indeed Cyril Ramaphosa, or is it perhaps A.J. Makashule? Or could it be Didi Mabuza? Or could it even be the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni? Because they all are different power cliques within the tripartite alliance. So one important conflict that needs to happen is that we have to find out, ideological and leadership conflict, who really is in charge of the tripartite alliance. Because clearly it is not Cyril Ramaphosa, because he gets overruled by one of his own ministers in terms of smoking. We saw that recently. Or sometimes we will get A.J. Makashule saying that the South African Reserve Bank is going to be nationalized, and the president saying, no, it's not going to be nationalized. We get these sort of conflicting messages all the time. We don't really know who's in charge. So that is something that needs to happen. We need to find out who is in charge. And I believe, and we all hear all these rumors all the time, that there's a lot of jockeying and infighting and fighting behind the scenes that we're not always aware of. But of course, that leads to a lot of confusion, that leads to a lot of uncertainty and a lot of political and economic confusion and uncertainty. And there are all sort of policies coming out, and we don't know what is the truth. Is the South African Reserve Bank going to be nationalized, or isn't it, as an example? Is South African Airways going to be closed down, or isn't it? We just do not know. Are we going to get prescribed assets, or are we not? We just do not know. So we need that conflict needs to play itself out. I must say that in the recent, it seems to me as if the president really consolidated much of his power in the recent weeks. But again, there has been talk recently of these opposition within the ANC, especially from Luthuli House, have also strengthened their position under the leadership of A.J. Makashule. So politically, there's a lot of uncertainty. And in the meantime, we have a government that's causing immense damage to the South African economy. So that's one conflict. The second conflict is there must be some conflict, it's inevitable, between whoever is in charge of the ANC and organized labor, especially COSATU, because COSATU essentially represents the civil service, and the civil service has become extremely powerful via COSATU, and there are simply too many civil servants and they're completely overpaid. So we need to cut back on state spending, but COSATU is not going to allow you doing that. So COSATU is simply not going to allow their members to take a pay cut. But the day will come, I promise you, when we have to start paying the civil servants less because we've run out of money. So expect some sort of conflict between whoever runs the ANC, because it's become inevitable now, and organized labor, especially COSATU. We saw some of that 2 years ago with the strikes at Eskom. That was one of those examples of the conflict that is brewing under the surface. Okay, that's some political comments. Also just keep in mind that the president was elected with a tiny majority, so he's a weak president in terms of his majority support within the alliance, firstly, because he was elected with a tiny minority. And secondly, he's also not a leader that likes to take the lead. He is a consensus person. He wants to talk to everybody. He's got committees and all sort of things, and he's not the person that takes the lead, which I think, especially under circumstances in which we find ourselves now, we need a strong leader, which we do not have at the moment. Okay, so there's some politics in South Africa. Are there any questions about that? I will get to that a little bit later. Let me just start talking about the South African economy. Now, talking about politics, I also have to say that, especially the past 10 years, but it happened before that, that we've done immense damage to, for example, the state-owned enterprises in South Africa. So state-owned enterprises are the Eskoms and South African Airways, the Airports Company, the whole bunch of them. And just about all the state-owned enterprises in South Africa have been run into the ground financially and operationally as well. They are all bankrupt, or just about all of them are bankrupt. I do not know of a single one that's not bankrupt. All of them owe massive amounts of money. In the case of Eskom, they owe nearly 500 billion rand. The same goes for South African Airways and most of the other. And they all want new bailouts. South African Airways wants new money. The land bank needs more money. Everybody needs more money. So the state-owned enterprises have been run into the ground, and we have been paying a huge economic and financial price for that. Economic in terms of a lack of electricity simply put a lid on the rate at which the South African economy can potentially grow. So the mere fact that we didn't have electricity is one of the reasons why the economy really expanded at a very, very slow rate the last couple of years. So the state-owned enterprises have been run into the ground, and this happened before. Similarly, what happened on the government's fiscal accounts, the fiscal accounts are the state's own financial position. Now that has deteriorated markedly especially the past 10 years. And that happened primarily while Pravin Gordhan was the Minister of Finance. And today the state debt levels, or it happened even before the last crisis, the state debt levels were at record high levels. The fiscal deficit was set at the budget of the Minister of Finance at the beginning of this year to be at 7% of GDP. And the debt levels were going to rise to an excess of 60% of GDP next year. That was before the virus, before the crisis. The South African economy, because of all of this, was in a recession already. Before the crisis, before the virus, the South African economy contracted for 2 subsequent economic quarters. So officially we were in a recession already. And in fact, if you compare the average South African's income, most South Africans have been getting poorer for the past 5 years already. So for 5 years, all of the average South African has been getting poorer and poorer by every year, while things like, for example, unemployment kept on going up, and poverty kept on going up, and the like. So we were in crisis before the last crisis. Now, let me just repeat that because this is very important. From now on, the politicians, of course, will make use the virus and blame everything on the virus. But we have to understand that we were in trouble, we were in a crisis before the virus, and we were in very deep trouble before the virus already. And it's the virus. Now, let me just make, before I get to what's going to happen to the economy now, let me just make 1 or 2 comments about the virus. Now, I've done some calculations. I made use of some other countries, and if there are any questions about that, I'll be happy to answer that. But let me just make a comment about economics or economic activity and the lives of individuals. The biggest killer out there, the biggest killer, a killer bigger than cancer or TB or malaria, or if you put all these bad things together, there's one killer that kills more people than all the other viruses and illnesses and things that people can get. And that killer's name is poverty. Poverty kills far more people than all the other bad things put together. If you look at rich countries and poor countries, for example, you will see that in everything that is good correlates with rich countries. Rich countries, they live much, much longer than people in poor countries. Rich countries got much better infrastructure. Quality of education is much better. Crime is much lower. All the good things go with wealth, while all the bad things correlate with poverty. And poverty, you will see in the case of South Africa, our life expectancy is around about 60 years. Compare that with the Europeans of a life expectancy around about 80 years. And that's one example of how poverty kills. We just don't live as long as wealthy countries. Poverty by far is the biggest killer. And because we've put this economy into a lockdown, and remember, it's not the virus causing the damage or much of the damage, it's the measures that have been put in place that's causing all this damage to the economy. There will be a huge increase in poverty in South Africa, and that will lead to the deaths of many hundreds of thousands of people over the next 10 years. In fact, I am absolutely convinced that over the next 10 years, more people will die because of poverty than people that will die because of the virus. So I think the approach that we are, and I must say, I supported the president initially with the lockdown decision. He acted quite presidential, including the Minister of Health. I think he also acted quite transparent, and I was very happy to follow their lead. So the initial reaction was the correct one. We didn't have enough information, but I'm afraid extending the lockdown is causing horrible damage to the economy, which is probably going to kill more people. The approach that we currently have, and the approach is close everything except for A, B, and C. That is wrong. The approach should be open up everything except for A, B, and C. And the A, B, and C's can be things like, for example, isolating old age homes, don't allow people to organize sport, that sort of stuff. I understand it, social distancing and the like. But closing down the economy is going to kill more people, I believe, than the virus itself. Okay, now here are some numbers. What's going to happen to the South African economy? According to my estimates, and remember, we haven't seen anything like this before. The only previous similar sort of event can be compared to, I think, is probably the Great Depression of the 1930s. So this is probably going to be similar. We're going to see a contraction of the South African economy to the tune of approximately 10%. Some economists expect even as much as 20% contraction. That is massive. That is absolutely horrible. So the economy contracting quite significantly. I expect at least 2 million job losses. 2 million people will lose their jobs. Many hundreds of thousands of people already lost their jobs. We're going to close many thousands of businesses. And it's not only, and of course, poverty will increase quite substantially as well. So it's not only the private sector that will be affected, and it's not only the private sector that will pay a huge price because of what is happening to the economy. The state itself will also pay a price in terms of the finances of the state. For example, the Minister of Finance expected his fiscal accounts. Remember, the fiscal accounts were in trouble already before the crisis. The Minister of Finance expected the beginning of this year, he expected the fiscal deficit of approximately 7% of GDP. Now, state revenue is probably going to be about 300 billion rand less than originally budgeted for, while state spending is going to be more now as they attempt to support the South African economy. And that means that they're going to see a fiscal deficit to the tune of approximately 15% of GDP, more than double what we saw previously. That means state debt levels, which previously would have gone to just over 60% of GDP in a year's time, is probably going to exceed 80% of GDP. And if you add the state-owned enterprises, their debt, which you should actually, be talking about state debt levels in excess of 90%. So the fiscal accounts has become completely unstable, totally unsustainable. And in future, that simply means one or two or three things. And that is that and I'm pretty sure there will be significant tax increases and maybe the introduction of new taxes like the wealth tax and so on. They've been talking about that already. And that also probably means that the state will try to cut back on state spending, which is going to be extremely difficult because remember, the state, the ANC lives off the state, but it's inevitable we may have to cut back on state spending. Not because they want to, but because they simply do not have a choice. But that probably also means that we could see things like prescribed assets, much more borrowing by the state, and eventually, I'm afraid, these sort of things will lead to more and more pressure on the South African Reserve Bank, and eventually these sort of things usually end in a form of very high levels of inflation. Not yet, but eventually that is where we're likely to be heading for. So I'm afraid, looking at the South African economy, we have much to be extremely concerned about. It's not only bad news. Some things are doing quite well in South Africa. One is the South African Reserve Bank is doing an absolutely splendid job. The South African Reserve Bank previously ran quite a conservative monetary policy approach. The interest rates were relatively high in South Africa. And Lesetja Kganyago, the governor of the Reserve Bank, is a very conservative central banker, and I think he's an excellent central banker. And now with this crisis, because the Reserve Bank has been running a relatively tight monetary policy ship, we actually have the space now for the Reserve Bank to do certain things, and they've done that. They've cut interest rates by quite a lot, nearly 300 basis points reduction in interest rates, which is the most we've ever had in South Africa in such a short period of time. So they've reduced interest rates quite substantially. The Reserve Bank also made some amendments to certain liquidity and capital requirements of the banks. And remember, the banks in South Africa are very, very tightly regulated, which is not always a good thing, but under crisis circumstances like what we have now, it certainly is a good thing. So our banks are very healthy. They were very, very tightly regulated by the Reserve Bank, and that allows the Reserve Bank now to lessen up a little bit on some of these regulations. And thirdly, the South African Reserve Bank is also printing money, pretty much like some of the other central banks, and using some of this money to buy certain financial assets on the secondary market, especially government debt instruments. So they're also printing money and buying some government debt instruments, but they haven't done this before. And the real test for the Reserve Bank is to get out of that market eventually. But so the point I want to make, the Reserve Bank has been relatively conservatively managed in the recent years, rightfully so, I believe. And that, of course, now allows the Reserve Bank to lighten up a little bit of monetary policy to support the South African economy. Unfortunately, the Reserve Bank can do so much and not more. The real issues in South Africa are certain other structural issues that we have in the country. And monetary policy certainly is going to help, but not that much, I'm afraid to say. And the interesting thing about monetary policy, you can get people, you can force people to stop borrowing money by increasing interest rates. So eventually people are going to say, listen, I'm not going to borrow money anymore because money is too expensive now. But you cannot force people to start borrowing money when people feel scared, because that's basically where we are. You can cut interest rates to zero. People are not going to run out and buy new cars because we're concerned about the economy, we're concerned about our own balance sheet, we're concerned about the future. So monetary policy can go this far, but not further. And in fact, I believe that because of the very weak demand in the economy and because of factors like falling oil prices, that the inflation rate is likely to fall quite a lot over the next couple of months. And there may even be a further cut in interest rates. I don't think it's necessary anymore. They've done what they can, but it is possible that monetary policy interest rates can be reduced even further. Also keep in mind that in a year or 18 months time or so, the inflation rate will turn around and then it will start going up again. And then the Reserve Bank will have to start tightening monetary policy again, start increasing interest rates. But that is in the medium term. For now, we can look forward to relatively low interest rates for the next year or two. And as the Reserve Bank maintains a very loose approach on monetary policy. When you talk about the Reserve Bank, you usually talk about the South African Rand as well. The South African Rand, the currency, is very, very much undervalued. It should be trading at much better levels. And there are many reasons why the Rand is undervalued. And currently, the Rand is trading at just about 17 to the US dollar. It was in excess of 19, on its way to 20 to the US dollar. I think it's totally overdone, and I believe that Rand should, and it's likely to strengthen a little bit further. We were downgraded again by Moody's not so long ago. So South Africa is junk now, and that had a huge impact on the exchange rate of the currency as well. A very important comment about the exchange rate of the currency, and this is important when it comes to investments, and I'll answer some of these investments questions just now. But remember, the South African Rand is a cheap currency. So it's cheap for foreigners to invest in South Africa. Secondly, the yields on our capital market is very, very attractive. We can give you 10% on government bonds, for example, compared to something below zero for the Germans. We give you, at least we pay you if you lend us money. And thirdly, the South African financial markets are very well developed and very liquid. So a foreigner, especially speculators, may look at South Africa and say, listen, but this is a wonderful opportunity. I am going to enter South Africa cheaply via a cheap currency, firstly. Secondly, I'm going to buy very attractive yielding instruments like the bond market in South Africa. And thirdly, if things go wrong, I can run quickly out because there's a lot of liquidity. So if you quickly want to take a bite out of the apple, South Africa certainly is the place to be. And if that should happen, then the Rand in the process will appreciate quite strongly. I don't think we're going to see, it's very unlikely that we're going to see 16 again or so, but the point I want to make in the short term, the currency is likely to move in any direction. And be careful, don't think the currency is only a one-way bet. That's important when you talk about investments. So let me make a few comments about investments. My advice to people always is when you talk about investments, make sure that you have a properly diversified portfolio. That's normal investment advice. There are a number of risks out there. The risks are, for instance, that the financial markets go up and down. So if you invest in the financial markets, you simply have to get used to the fact that the financial markets go up and down. You can manage your investments. You should have an asset manager to look after your investments. But you have to make peace with the fact that the financial markets are volatile and it's likely to go up and down. That is your risk. But although me and my firm, we keep on advising people to invest on the financial markets, and you have to do it in a proper manner. There's another risk, and that's the exchange rate of the currency. I've mentioned that already. So if you take your money out of the currency, out of the country, which I advise people to do, then if the rand appreciates in rand terms, your portfolio will fall in value. The biggest risk out there, and that's a risk that nobody should ever take, is what I call institutional risk. And that simply means that you have to know who you are doing business with. Do your homework before you give your money to somebody. Some other advice, I do advise people to take their money out of the country at the right time. Get an advisor or financial expert or asset managers to assist you with that. You take your money out of South Africa, substantially, not all of it, of course, you still have to live in South Africa, and depending on individual to individual, but you have to structure your portfolio in such a manner that you have at least a substantial portion of your assets invested abroad to take some of your money out of South Africa. There are many opportunities still in South Africa, so my advice is make your money here, take it out, basically, because we've got a government making life quite difficult for us. There are some investment advice that I think are important. And maybe this last few comments on what the future is going to look like. I think what we have here is the fourth industrial revolution all over us all of a sudden. The fourth industrial revolution has been put into fast forward, although this is a very good example of this technology we're using at the moment. And that will have certain impacts. Now, here are some things that you probably all know already about, but we saw it previously, and some of these trends will simply become stronger now. One is that people will buy more online. Now, and we've seen that already. And if people buy more online, that means normal retail shops are probably going to suffer. And normal retail property prices are likely to come down. So retail property prices, I also believe, normal property prices, so residential property prices are going to fall at least over the next couple of years, over the next couple of months or so, at least in South Africa. Then things could change a little bit. People are going to work from home much more than in the past. People are going to demand better and more luxuries at home. So where houses were getting smaller and smaller in the past, or apartments were getting smaller and smaller, we may enter into a phase where apartments may be getting a little bit more luxurious and a little bit more expensive, maybe even as well because of that. So initially, I think property prices will come down. Thereafter, the demand for property will be different. And maybe even people may start living together more, bigger families, moving into one bigger property. And that means that there could be a demand even for bigger houses in future. That's one trend. Another interesting trend is that we can pick up in places like China, for instance, is that the economies will lock down. And when they open up the economies, everybody thought that they're going to rush back to the restaurants, and everybody thought that people will go to restaurants and start buying again. That's not happening. That's a weird thing. I think this virus may change the spending habits of spending patterns of individuals permanently. And I think in future, we will order more food instead of going to a restaurant. In future, your hairdresser will come to your house, maybe, and instead of you going to the hairdresser. And of course, you will order things online mostly, many instances. And this is the kind of things that will likely to happen. Another trend that I think is a few things that I think are very important as well is that modern economies, in South Africa is a mixture of all sort of economies, but modern economies, the part of the economy that is growing is the tertiary industries. The tertiary industries are typically tourism, under normal circumstances, tourism, services generally speaking, finance, let's call it IT, things like typically Google and Microsoft, that sort of companies. That is where growth has been taking place. Now with the virus, of course, certain industries, also in the tertiary industries, will be affected. Tourism will be very, very hard hit. It's probably going to take years for the tourism industry worldwide, but in South Africa as well, to get out of the hole in which they find themselves at the moment. So tourism will be very hard hit. But some other things are going to change, and typically the services will be, especially those kind of services that can be associated with the digital industry. A good example is finance. I think finance is one of those industries. Another very good example is education. I'm suddenly a grade 1 teacher, and I'm amazed about all the tools that are available and how easy it is to actually teach. Well, easy, not for me, but the tools are there, and I believe there could be many business opportunities as well. So I think that is the part of the economy that's really going to grow in future, and it will become much, much more important. That's the tertiary industry, the service industry, and especially the digital service industry, which will become much more important in future. And another trend that I think is important as well is that people are, all of a sudden they know who my neighbors are. We put all sort of things together in my estate where we are. And I think that's also a new trend that can be expected. In future, we're probably going to see more of that. Regionalism will become more important, and people will start working together on a local basis much more than in the past. So the idea of centralizing all power that we've had in the past, that we're probably not going to see that in future. So I think this idea of a very centralized government is something of the past. And maybe a last comment about that is that what we're currently seeing is politicians taking more and more power. What we're currently seeing is that politicians have become very, very powerful, politicians and bureaucrats, and I don't think they're going to stop with that. And that's a big challenge for us going forward. After this crisis, we have to make sure that we take back our liberties that they've taken away from us. That's not going to be, that's the default mode. They like that. They like all this power. They're not going to give that back. And in fact, they are going to try to expand the influence of the state. And as the state expands and gets involved in more things in the economy, and because of the highly inefficient nature of the South African government, there more and more things will simply be done even worse by the state. And that's where the opportunities are. We've already seen many of these sort of things. Like, for example, basically the police force in South Africa has been privatized because the number of private security firms, private security employees in South Africa are more than double that what we have compared to the official police force. The police is just not efficient anymore. The same goes for education. We've basically privatized education, and we're going to see more of that. So there are the opportunities. See what the state is doing, because they can't do it well, and that's where your opportunities are. And also in energy, by the way, I believe there are some opportunities in energy. I've got some questions here. Let me just go through some of these questions. Yeah, the question about taking money out of South Africa. Yes, you can also, but our approach, what we do, we've got a 3 silo approach, what we typically follow in my company. So we put your long-term money abroad in some sort of instrument. There are many different instruments available depending on the requirements of the client. So put long-term money outside of South Africa, and then put some shorter-term, medium-term money in South Africa, typically, say, for example, in a unit trust or managed share portfolio, and the money that you live off, typically in a money market kind of fund. So that's the 3 silo approach that we have. So you live off your money market money, typically. Once you've used that, you take some of your investments and put it into the money market. Once you've depleted that, you move to the 3rd silo, and that starts bringing from money abroad back into South Africa. So that's the kind of approach that we follow for our investments and our clients. So the longer term money is abroad, and there we try to, and remember, it's important to take some risk as well. Risk is where you're going to get your returns. In fact, if you put money in the money market, quite often after inflation and after taxes, it's a guaranteed loss. Now, that is high risk sometimes to put money in money market. So don't shy away from the risk. Risk is a good thing, because risk, if it's properly managed, can give you quite good returns. The next question is, do we actually know how much money South Africa will borrow from the International Monetary Fund? And will the government be forced to account for money spent? Yes. Well, government is supposed to account on all the money spent. The Auditor General audits the state's books, and also the other levels of the state, like the state-owned enterprises and the local authorities and so on. And if you read the Auditor General's report, that's a horror story, I can tell you. 3/4 of the local authorities, as an example, are financially mismanaged. But yes, theoretically, they're supposed to account for all this money spent on various things. So you're always supposed to be account for that. Do we need an IMF loan? And the short answer is no. You don't need to go to the IMF for a loan. And the reason is because the South African Reserve Bank, again, under the leadership of Mr. Kanyama, what he's done is manage monetary policy quite conservatively, and we have in excess of $50 billion in reserves at the South African Reserve Bank. And remember, if you borrow money from the IMF, you borrow dollars. So what do you want to use the dollars for? That's not the problem. The problem is we've got not enough rands. And so that's part of the reason. Now, we don't need an IMF loan. We need to cut back on state spending, preferably. Beside the huge SOE debts, this is another question, with Kusata having to make cuts, how will this affect the South African economy, demand and street? Any idea of timelines as to when this is likely to happen, as it appears to be unavoidable? Yes. That is exactly what I think is going to happen, and that is that it is unavoidable. We are running out of money. There will be cuts made to state spending because there isn't money available anymore. And that's why I'm concerned about new taxes and about things like prescribed assets and the like, which I think will be implemented as well over time. But eventually, inflation will be the result of all of this unless we, of course, turn the ship around, which is going to be very difficult politically. And inflation means a reduction in your salary. So inflation will reduce state spending in a way. But inflation, of course, will also reduce the debt in the real terms, the value of debt. But as long as Lesetja Kanyako is there, I'm not too concerned about that. Here's another question from Gerard. Dankie vir die inligting, Dawie, waardeer dit. Ek is nuuskierig hoekom private maatskappye soos Allen Gray Coronation en ander industries soos Batch ensovoort nie 'n standpunt in die huidige regering dit voel asof. The question basically is, why is it that the private sector and business not taking a stand against government? Yes, that's an excellent question. But that's we find it everywhere in the world, is that the private sector is too busy running their businesses than criticizing government. But what I found recently is that, we have seen some private sector business people standing up and taking a stand against government. So we're seeing that more and more. It's becoming more and more frequent now. Yes, but typically, traditionally, it's not only in South Africa, but business people don't stand up. They're too busy making money and busy working. But I think I can see some of that. Another question, do I anticipate a lot more civil unrest? Unfortunately, yes. We will see a huge increase in unemployment and poverty. And I'm afraid because of the horrible services that the state delivers in terms of water and sanitation and normal infrastructure. And we've seen an increase in unrest already. We're probably going to see more of that. There's another question from Lydia Larue. Why has the cryptocurrency market been so volatile of late? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm a great fan of the cryptocurrencies, but let me just make a very important point. That is that I don't believe that's an investment. So I do advise people, go and buy 100 rands worth of Bitcoin or whatever, and download the software and get used to the software and learn about that. That's very important, but it's not an investment. It is not an investment, but it's a new technology, and I believe this technology is going to really change the way that we do business. So I'm very excited about this new technology, the so-called cryptocurrencies. I prefer to call it private money. So learn about that, but be very, very careful. It's not an investment, and very careful with your passwords and personal information like anywhere else. And the reason why it's been this quite volatile recently is, I think part of the reason for that has to do with the volatility that we saw in the financial markets as well. I think over time that the so-called private monies will become more and more important. Do I see, this is from Laurie Drake, do we see an opportunity in cryptocurrency, and is this risky or not? It is, I've mentioned that, it is quite risky, be very careful. It's the technology that matters, not the private currencies as such. But having said that, I think that we're going to see a revolution in finance, and finance will be changed, especially banking and payment systems will be changed completely and totally by cryptocurrencies in the future. Make sure you understand the technology, and especially countries like South Africa are ideally placed to benefit from that. There's a question from A&R. Should your long-term money, offshore money, be kept in your name or rather in a structure such as an offshore trust? Yes, that's another maybe an important point. If you're taking money abroad, it's important to take your money abroad or part of your portfolio abroad, but it's also important, depending on various factors, to have the right structures. You can put your money in your own name. There are certain structures available. But then you run risk, like, for example, something should happen to you, and it's usually quite a hassle to get the money back. So make sure that you've got the right structures abroad, and the structures can include what we call wrappers, for example, or certain offshore trusts, or maybe even companies. So get advice from a qualified financial advisor to advise you on that. But that's an excellent question. It's not only taking money out, it's also making sure that the structures are the correct structures. Then this is a question from you, Kannenberg. Is there any truth that China is lending South Africa funds knowing that we will be unable to repay? China certainly has lent money to South Africa, but they've stopped doing that. There's a relatively large amount of money, I think it's something like $7 billion, that they promised to lend to Eskom, and they've decided not. They're holding the money back. So yes, China is lending South Africa money. They have in the past. And remember, there's a bank, it's the so-called BRICS Bank, and South Africa and China and Russia and Brazil, we are all members of this BRICS Bank, and South Africa is also borrowing money from the BRICS Bank, and so is China, by the way. So yes, we are borrowing money from China, but I'm not too concerned about that. We are certainly not borrowing as much money from China as, for example, Ethiopia or Kenya, or so some of those countries. So no, I'm not too concerned about that, and I'm also not too concerned about China. And maybe another side comment about China is that clearly the sentiment towards China internationally is certainly changing. And you can see the tension is building up, obviously, between Trump and China, but also between the Europeans and the Chinese. So there's this breakneck economic growth that we saw in China the last 10, 15 years or so. That is probably something of the past. All right, thank you, Helen. Thank you for those kind words of you. If there are any other questions, I'm waiting. I'm having a look at the chat group. If anybody wants to get hold of me, my email address is dawieroodt@efgroup.co.za. dawieroodt@efgroup.co.za. And there's something else I need to mention before I go. And let me just open my notes. I've had some notes on that, and I need to mention one or two things. One is, okay, there was a question about the future of taxes. I think that I've answered this. Is this the fourth industrial revolution? Yes, it is in a way. But the revolution, this kind of revolution is not a once-off event. It's a progress, or it's a process, and that's indeed where we are. It's been accelerated without a doubt. Are we heading in South Africa? I must tell you, I'm concerned about political future of South Africa, but I think I've discussed that as well. And then the last comment that is very important for me to make, and that is that I'm doing this, of course, for the Guide Dog Association. I think it's important for all of us that if you want to give money, and I think we should do that. Remember, there are some tax benefits. The state is not very good at spending your money. So if you do get the opportunity to give money to a charity like this one, please do that. And remember, you can get the tax break on that. So please give money to the Guide Dog Association. There are some other questions. Let me see if I... Ron, thank you very much. Guide Dog beneficiaries. Okay, and your will. Oh, that's wonderful, Helen. For the Guide Dog people, do that. Thank you very much, you. Cheryl, thank you very much for your nice comment. Baie dankie almal. Julle almal, baie dankie almal. One more on cryptocurrencies. Do you think there is a good chance that we will accept cryptocurrencies payments in the near future, especially for SMMEs to provide services? Yes, I do believe that. I believe cryptocurrencies may become much more dominant than what they are at the moment, and I believe in future that businesses will come together and work together on certain networks and create their own currencies as well. Yes, that's something I think can happen. How far do you see the interest rates dropping? Not by much more interest. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Helen, thank you. Rui, thank you for your nice comments. You, thank you for all your history. Okay, I've answered that. And then at the bottom, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ron, hello Ron. Good hearing from you. Thank you, Ron. Thanks. Dankie Ron van Ontbytsake. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Guide Dog on my school card beneficiary. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh yes, there's the comment. Thank you, David, for the positive news. And then good news about Dudu Manyeni. And I hope in future, yes, indeed, we're going to see more prosecutions. They've apparently arrested some people for certain transgressions during the time of the lockdown. How many state capturers have been arrested during that time? It's a good question. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Baie dankie oom Dawie. Dankie Nico. Of Nikki, Bou, Nikki. Vir oom Dawie, dis 'n plesier. Oom Dawie doen dit met vreugde. And we've seen the global markets bounce back to some degree from COVID-19, but history has shown us that there is a pattern of volatility and perhaps even a drop before an out to correction. Yes, it is. We've seen the markets, quite a nice run in the markets in recent weeks. It's nearly impossible to time the financial markets, so I'm not going to give you an idea on the timing of financial markets, but rest assured the financial markets will remain volatile. The best that you can do is get a good asset manager, look after your assets, and to buy based on fundamentals and not on technicals. I'm a fundamentalist, and I like to analyze the investments that we do from a fundamental point of view. Thank you all for this. I really appreciate it, and thank you very much again for the invitation. It was really nice talking to you, although I couldn't hear a thing, but I could see the reactions out there. Thank you so much.